Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Weckerly, and welcome to the Ready Living podcast, where each episode is designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to create the life you want. My guest today is Mark Randell. He's a retired senior detective from the UK Police who specialized in covert operations on serious crime and within international collaboration. He now investigates and trains about animal crimes around the world, with a current focus on the animal-human abuse connection within relationships, families, and community. He's a campaign manager for Nature Watch Foundation, a charity in the UK, and founder of Hidden Insight. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, lovely to meet you. Thank you for inviting me.
You spent over 30 years with the Sussex Police in southeast England, where you tackled everything from local crimes to high-stakes international operations. You worked on narcotics, high-volume theft, human trafficking, and murder cases, and carried out projects in several countries, including the Netherlands, Albania, the United States, South Africa, and Australia. But you didn't stop there. After a long career in law enforcement, instead of stepping away, you chose to pivot to a different yet equally challenging arena, animal protection. For several years, you were director of operations at the League Against Cruel Sports, and then founded Hidden Insight in 2013. What initially drew you to a career in law enforcement, and then, after 3 decades of confronting some of the darkest facets of human behavior, motivated you to continue fighting for justice, but this time for animals?
It's quite difficult, really, to go back and trying to think what the decisions were that led me into law enforcement. I think kind of ever since I can remember, I've always felt that justice was really important and really disliked injustice. And there were a couple of instances, I suppose, at that point. One was when I was tiny. I probably wasn't much more than about 8. And there was one of my teachers was a real bully at that point. And it grated with me, not just with me, but with everybody else. And I know I kind of threatened him at the age of 8 that I was going to come back as a police officer and arrest him. And I didn't do that, clearly. But even at that age, there was something in me that made me feel like I needed to do something. And I was fascinated. There used to be a lot of old police officer shows when I was young, and I just loved watching them. But in that day, it was very much about the old traditional British police officer helping out and deal with good old criminals who play by the rules. Sadly, they don't do that quite so much nowadays, I guess. But I suppose they were the triggers. And also, weirdly, in my background, in my genetic history from my great-grandfather and beyond, there were police officers, although I didn't know it at the time. So I guess there was something in there from a very early age. And as soon as I had the opportunity to do it, that's what I wanted to do. So
That's fascinating. So obviously you had a strong sense of justice early on, and then also a strong desire to help others.
yeah, I mean, it started with animals. I always wanted to be around animals, and I'm sure we'll come on to that later. But I love being around all kinds of animals. I've got 2 sisters, and they hated cats. They just didn't get. They were petrified of cats, and I used to go and collect cats and just to bring them back, and I wanted to be around them, and much to their distaste. And of course, the cats would always come to me, and they weren't too keen on that. Yeah, whatever animal it was, I wanted to be there and look after it, really, and spend time with it.
That's lovely. We were talking about Hidden Insight just a second ago. The organization conducts investigations and educates others on how to use investigative techniques in advocacy and legal proceedings. But I'm really curious about the organization's name. Can you tell us about that?
I really came from an idea when I first moved out from policing into animal welfare world. It was almost like 2 sides, but trying to achieve the same thing. So police officers had a big distrust of animal groups. Animal groups had a big distrust of the police. And I didn't really know why, because they were actually aiming at the same objective. And so what I wanted to really do was to show how, coming from one background, I could perhaps reach the other one. I used to do sort of a lot of negotiations and work within policing, and I kind of wanted to try and reach both sides and say, hey, look, you're both going in the same direction here. What's the battle between you? Let's find some middle ground. And Hidden Insight really came from covert operations, and from that's what I was doing. Was we were hidden in sight, but also it's about those crimes that are under the surface, those ones that you walk past every day, whether it's counterterrorism or domestic abuse, without seeing it, and it's about exposing that and saying, hey, look, if you just lift the stone, you'll actually see what reality is really like. So that's how the name came about.
It's brilliant. How did the experiences and skills investigating serious crime and experiences from your police work translate into your efforts to combat animal cruelty? Can you give us a bit of a broad overview of the approach you would take when investigating cases of animal mistreatment, abuse, and cruelty?
I suppose I majored quite strongly within criminal motivation, and within undercover policing that's really important because you need to find what makes the criminal tick, what's underneath the surface, why they do what they do. And then if you need to infiltrate them, you need to work out what they're doing. You need to find the gap in their criminal enterprise, in their modus operandi that is missing, and offer it to them once you've identified what their motivation is, and put it in such a place that they hook onto it because they feel that it's going to complete the final part of what it is they want to achieve. And at that point, you've then got them effectively hooked, so you can start doing that investigation. And that motivation transcends whatever the crime type is. An example, which I just mentioned at the moment, could be like speeding on a motorway or speeding on a freeway. Rather than the fact that person is actually doing it, why are they doing it? Because if you only ever tackle the reason that they're doing it, you're never going to solve the problem. You're only ever going to scratch the surface. If you look at why they're doing it and you deal with the root cause of the problem, then you're actually going to solve the crime type. So that's the same whether it's, as I say, it's terrorism, domestic abuse, whether it's animal abuse. And so when you're tackling an animal abuse case, you just think of it exactly the same as you would everything else. Try and simplify everything to the most common denominator, I guess.
So that makes me wonder how you strike a balance between getting into the mind of a criminal and understanding what their motivation is, and to a certain extent being able to walk in their footsteps without it impacting you to the point where you're not able to be effective anymore because of the seriousness of the things that you're looking at.
It's an interesting question that I get asked quite a lot, and particularly actually from young lawyers. I've had the opportunity to train in Indian universities, Ukrainian universities, and British universities, for an example. And young lawyers tend to ask me that same question. The first thing is to only ever look at it for the level that you need to look at it, to not get immersed in it emotionally. For example, if you're looking at an animal abuse case, then unless you need to look at what the animal abuse is, don't look at it. If you need to identify who are the people involved in it by the type of T-shirt they're wearing, then when you look at that image or that video or that document, that's what you need to focus on, not the graphic detail that then hits you emotionally. It's a bit clinical. It doesn't always work, but that's probably one of the tactics. I mean, the other thing is you just kind of get used to it. And that's a bit sad in a lot of ways, but after a period of time, I was policing the streets at 19. So I was seeing stuff at 19, which I shouldn't have been seeing at 19. And probably it has left an effect on me, but it's just something I've kind of got used to, I suppose. I do overly think a lot, but not about that particular issue.
When training law enforcement, does the training differ whether you're working with patrol officers, let's say, versus detectives or specialized units?
Yeah, and it varies depending on the individual that you're speaking to. Another common thing that I found moving again from policing world into animal world is that a lot of animal world people are really, really good around animals, clearly. Let's take, for example, dogs. We could be talking any animals, but let's talk about dogs here. Most animal trainers or all animal trainers will know that all dogs are individuals. But yet, when they deal with a police officer, they will deal with the police officer as if they are a robot, they're all doing the same thing. And that approach doesn't work. If you talk to two different people, you're going to get a different response. So you have to adapt your communication style to whoever it is you're talking to. So yes, first responders or patrol officers may well have a similar kind of training. A specialist officer may again have a similar kind of training. But even within that, they're all specialists. You could have the police officer who is new, keen, he wants to be promoted, he wants to change the world, he wants to show himself in a great light. You might get a police officer who really just wants to look at where his next donut is coming from. He's really not that keen on work. He pays the bills and that's about all he does. Yes, the label of first responder or the label of specialist police officer is important, But even within that, you need to look at whether they're an individual and what it is that's going to resonate with them to make them think differently. And if I can, I don't want to tell them what to think. I kind of want them to just have a few ideas so that they then go away and come up with the solutions themselves. Far better that you kind of just steer people, I think, in the right direction. And then when they come back a while later, they've changed policy and strategy, and you think, yeah, that was great. I've put that seed in that's helped create that change.
That's super interesting. So obviously you're applying the skills you learned in policing in dealing with nefarious groups with also motivating peers and colleagues in the field.
Yeah, I mean, they're all still people. I mean, they're criminals or law-abiding citizens or police officers. They're just people. Even those police officers, even those criminals who you would look at and think they are really bad individuals. They're child sex offenders. That's still a person. It's still a person who thinks as a person. And if you don't try and understand that, then you can't help society be safer by just taking a one-dimensional approach into dealing with them. You need to understand how they tick and then try and work with that. Clearly, sometimes it's not going to work. You're never going to change them. You're never going to prevent them committing crime, at which point you need to lock them up or you need to put them away from society. But hopefully, you don't need to take a one-step approach to do that either.
There are a lot of people who aren't aware of the connection between seemingly disparate crimes like wildlife crime and organized crime, or dogfighting and gang crime, drugs and illegal weapons.
I take something like dogfighting, I guess, as an example. A lot of people who speak to me about dogfighting talk about it being about betting and about trying to make money. But generally, actually, it's about power and control. It's about someone trying to show off their level of importance through their dog. I'm probably going to say this, but they're inadequate as an individual. They feel inadequate. So they want to be able to show themselves to be better than they are through the use of their dog. So they're going to use their dog as a tool. Well, that kind of individual will also do the same by the use of a firearm, for example, or through drug use. Those connections are not necessarily, again, as black and white as, dog fighters are into gang crime, because dog fighters are into all sorts of other crime. I've seen strong links with right-wing extremism, with child pornography, with dog fighting. It's a sort of an interwoven criminality. But if we are going to generalise, then yes, dog fighters are almost always into some kind of organised crime. Animal abuse, domestic abuse, elder abuse and child abuse are all very, very heavily interlinked. And because, they want to prey on the weakest part within that relationship, the person or animal that they see as the weakest part in that relationship, that family or that community. If that happens to be a dog or a cat, that's what they'll do. If it happens to be a child or grandmother or or their spouse, that's what they'll do. They figure out which one they're going to target. It'll just be the one that they perceive to be the weak link.
You talked a little bit about the profile of dog fighters. Is it the same with cockfighting?
Cockfighting in the UK is certainly nothing like as prevalent as dogfighting. What you tend to see globally is that both, I'm going to call them blood sports because they're not sports, they have a strong cultural background. So therefore, even within dogfighting, within one country, you will have a number of disparate groups who are essentially committing one crime type, dogfighting, but actually doing it slightly differently, different types of dogs, different types of rules. Cockfighting probably is more culturally based, again, very generally, than dogfighting, because that's evolved a lot more. There's a lot more dogfighters. Cockfighting is still very, very isolated to certain communities. And I'm going to say it's rare in the UK. It's not found that often. But I would say it's probably more culturally linked than dogfighting is nowadays.
Interesting. Earlier, I mentioned that you're a campaign manager for the UK charity Nature Watch Foundation, where you're focusing on the link between animal cruelty and violence against humans, demonstrating that these issues are deeply interconnected. What exactly is this connection?
If you look at perhaps a domestic abuse situation from the eyes of the perpetrator and what they want to achieve, they will look at how is the best way they can exert power and control over somebody. And traditionally, it was seen as a punch, as an act of violence. But it's gradually being understood a lot more that it's about coercive control. It's about some point in that relationship, and it's very, very relevant where that point is. But at some point in that relationship, ability of that survivor to think for themselves are taken away by the perpetrator. When there's an animal there, either because it's been brought in by the perpetrator or it was because it was there before the human relationship started up, the perpetrator will recognise that and they will start to see that this is an opportunity that they can exploit. And at the same time they're doing that, obviously the survivor is then building perhaps a stronger bond with their cat or their dog because it's their go-to support network. And of course, that's exactly what the perpetrator wants. It sees that relationship building, and it gives the perpetrator an opportunity to continue to exploit it. And so you end up with something is going to snap at some point. And unfortunately, that's why we end up with a lot of domestic homicides, because a lot of them have come from a coercive controlling situation.
I want to go back to training law enforcement and law enforcement agencies. And I'm wondering how you go about communicating this animal human abuse link to agencies and what kind of responses you've received regarding the importance of recognizing this link in policing and investigations.
The most common response is that everybody's too busy to deal with animal cases. Most law enforcement, most police officers have got a huge to-do list. They're always being asked to pick up all the bits of society that nobody else wants to pick up, and that will include mental health, it now includes cybercrime. The list becomes more and more heavy for them to deal with. So the general response is just, I haven't got time for this. It's about explaining how that by tackling things preventatively, you can actually start to create time for people. If you start to get ahead of the situation, in a particular case in Ukraine that I'm aware of, where there were 21 murders committed by 3 young men who previously killed stray animals. That took 2,000 police officers to investigate that. Well, if they kind of prevented that happening in the first place, not only would you have saved the lives of 21 vulnerable individuals, but you wouldn't have had to put a massive task force on it in the first place, which gives you more policing resources to then put into other crimes, and you actually start to get ahead of things. The biggest question is, I don't have time for animal cases. They're only animals. I've got too much to do anyway. So it's about trying to explain that if you do think like that, just try and have a look at it from a slightly different angle and just see it as an opportunity or a tool to be able to help you prevent crime. I mean, this really comes from, when I was in policing, I was looking at a gun running operation, and those that were involved in the gun running were dog fighters, but we didn't look at the dog fighting because that's what police officers, they didn't do that. And we actually missed an opportunity to deal with the gun criminals because we didn't look at the dog fighting. Actually, we could have, the old Al Capone theory, we could have actually taken them out of the dog fighting and prevented the gun crime by doing so. And I learned from that. I made some mistakes, and we all make mistakes, but tackling animal abuse is an opportunity, not a chore.
I'm a big proponent of prevention as well.
I mean, with counterterrorism, you can't, I did spend a lot of while working in counterterrorism. You can't deal reactively with terrorism issues. You have to be preventative for obvious reasons because they're huge. Generally speaking, we've got it right with terrorism, so let's get it right with other crimes as well.
I love that. I saw mention online that the Metropolitan Police Domestic Abuse Team has been supportive of your work, updating policies and training across London to ensure that animal cruelty offences are charged alongside domestic abuse crimes where both are present during the commission of an offence. What's the benefit of doing that?
Probably, in fact, I can probably go back a couple of hundred years for the first example of that. In the first piece of animal welfare legislation came out in 1822 in England and Wales. In 1830, the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was formed and then it became the Royal Society after it received patronage. And it wasn't until 1835 that the first dogfighting laws came into place. But in 1830, so 5 years before the dogfighting law, the society took those were dogfighting very closest to the Houses of Parliament in the UK. They took them to court for public nuisance. So they looked for another potential way of being able to take someone and prosecute them through the system to be able to achieve their goal. And working with the Metropolitan Police now, which of course, the heart of which is just over the road from where the Westminster pit, the dogfighting pit, was in 1830. It's about explaining to them that domestic abuse is really difficult to be able to prosecute and charge and make arrests for. If there are other offences, they may at least give you some breathing space, may give the survivor an opportunity to leave. It may give you an opportunity to have a conviction added to somebody, which may well get them into a system in the future. It may take the animal away from that person. We know that it's more likely that if a perpetrator takes an animal into a domestic abuse situation, they are likely to abuse them because they want to set that up to be able to abuse it. So it may well be taking the animal away might give you that opportunity. There are different powers that you have under the Animal Welfare Act that you don't have under Domestic Abuse Act. You need to think laterally about it, and animal abuse is one particular example. Look at everything that's open to you to achieve the goal that it is you want to achieve.
What are some key points or strategies you emphasize when speaking with legislators, and what changes are you advocating for them in terms of policy and legislation?
a lot of instances there is already some decent law out there. It's just not used. That's the first thing. And that's the same. If I was doing an undercover investigation, the first thing I would look at is what currently exists. What gaps do I need to fill? I don't need to go out and do it all again. So have a look at what currently exists. Make sure that what has been charged and has been used is appropriate. So, for example, in England and Wales, we had a lot of battles trying to get the animal cruelty sentencing bill through Parliament to increase from 6 months to 5 years. And as a result, people who were killing cats with knives were being charged with criminal damage. Their records were wrongly attached to them for an offence of criminal damage, which is going to be the same as breaking a window. So make sure that if the legislation is appropriate, but then also looking at what else exists for legislation. So, I'm going to talk about Ukraine here for an example. Under Ukrainian criminal code, it's the only criminal code in the world that adds additional jail time for animal abuse committed in front of children because it recognises the importance of that. And they also, within the criminal code, have a piece of legislation which is almost like incitement to offend. It's about creating a culture whereby you are making people commit criminal behaviour. So have a look around the world and find some best legal product and bring it in and use it, incorporate it in your own legislation. In England and Wales and other countries, there tends to be an attitude that, we started it, therefore everybody can learn from us. Well, actually, we can all learn from each other within this. Have a look at what's around. Greece has got the maximum jail sentence in Europe now for animal cruelty at 10 years. Different pockets have some really good ideas. We've got the rental rights bill going through, hopefully the UK in the next year. New Zealand are already slightly ahead on that piece of legislation. It doesn't matter they're ahead. Doesn't matter. They're not going to beat us. It's not the Olympics. We're not going to win a medal for it. Let's look at it and learn from it and try and iron out any problems that other people may have had, and then we can make the best legislation.
When a situation escalates beyond threats of harm to animals to actual harm, recognizing non-accidental injuries in animals can protect survivors of domestic abuse, emphasizing the importance of addressing the protection of animals and the protection of people together. How prevalent is multi-agency information sharing currently?
It's difficult to answer that one easily, but it's a lot better than it was. We've had a number of significant events. I know you have in the US, and certainly we have in the UK, where lack of information sharing has led to some pretty disastrous consequences. I think there's a long way to go still, but there's generally a willingness to make it happen, to listen. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. You mentioned League Against Cruel Sports. When I started there, I went into Scotland Yard and I was being spoken to as if I was some kind of extremist who was going to create chaos within society by my attitude. So that was only like 13 years ago. Now I'm going into Scotland Yard and they're kind of going, yeah, you've actually got some good ideas, and listen to that and listen to other people. There's a real willingness to make that public information sharing, that bringing in new ideas into public protection work. And it's hugely encouraging. It really is, for someone who's been doing this a little while like I have.
Incrementally, I see some of this advancement that you're talking about, and that is very encouraging.
It could always be quicker, but it's positive progress. People have been talking about the link. I often mention about this engraver called William Hogarth, who in 1751 was an animal campaigner then, and he was talking about the link between animal abuse and domestic homicide. That's 270 years ago, and we're still talking about it.
So I'm wondering, for the listeners out there, if you could help explain for someone on the outside, are there particular signs people should be on the lookout for, particularly as it pertains to coercive control in animals?
I try and simplify this as best I can. A Greek vet said to me one day that animal abuse begins where welfare ends. There are essentially 5 freedoms around animals. In theory, as a pet owner, as a farm animal owner, you should be giving those freedoms to the animals. If you choose not to do it because you don't understand, then maybe the solution is education. If you choose not to do it through some kind of motivation, nefarious motivation, then potentially you're an animal abuser. But if you don't give that animal those rights because you are being prevented from doing so by somebody else, I think you're looking at animal abuse within coercive control. So say, for example, you want to take your pet cat to the vets, but your partner is saying you're not allowed to do that. You want to take your dog out for a walk to meet other people and to socialise the dog, and you're being prevented from doing that. You want to be able to provide some good quality food for your pet, and you're prevented from doing so by your partner. Then you're starting to look at coercive control. So I think you look at, is that animal getting the welfare? And if it isn't getting the welfare, why not? You're almost looking at a crime scene yourself. So much of this is about understanding crime scenes. And we've all watched crime scenes. We all watched Sherlock Holmes. We've all watched, how you read the situation. You don't need to be a detective or a police officer to read the situation. You look in your community, you understand your community, you know what your neighbours are doing, you know what's normal and acceptable behaviour. Don't just try and justify it to yourself. Oh, well, it's probably because it's probably then ask that question. Be a little bit professionally inquisitive is quite a good phrase. Why is that happening? If you can't explain it, then you need to be talking to a professional or referring it to a professional.
For people who want to flee abusive and violent domestic situations, being unable to take their companion animals to a shelter or have a safe place for them to stay is often an obstacle to them leaving. It's the same with children. There are organizations working to provide animal fostering services like Refugee for Pets, an organization that serves people across Devon and Cornwall, I believe, and to which you recently became a trustee, and Red Rover, and Don't Forget the Pets here in the US, that helps establish foster programs and help domestic violence shelters build areas where people can keep their companions. Tell us about your involvement with Refugee for Pets.
This kind of started for me. I was doing some training in northern Italy, which happened to be the place I worked where they had the best food I think I've ever worked. But but I'm digressing there. But I went into a police station in northern Italy, and they had an area where victim survivors would be taken, and there was a table there for children to do some colouring and to sit and play while they're being interviewed. And just in the corner of that room, there was a dog bed with a dog bowl and water. And it sort of struck me the importance of keeping that whole family unit together. It's important at any time, if you've got a child growing up with an animal, they're part of the family. That's where they learn from, certainly where I learned from. When you're in a stressful situation, that's even more important that you keep that family together. And organisations like Refuge for Pets or Cats Protection or Dogs Trust in the UK and certainly others overseas do that. They're charities, and there'll be 501s in the US, they're charities, they do it out of the goodness of their heart, but they're not government funded. I think there is some government funding in Australia, which is quite good, but certainly not in the UK or as far as I know, the US. We need a better system because they can only deal with the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about, again, in the UK, it's 2.4 million people a year affected by domestic abuse. That's a huge number. These small organisations can't do that. They do incredible work. They're critically important, but we need to support them. We need to support not just the animals that are caught up with the domestic abuse, but the families that surround those animals as well. We need to support them.
Right. And you were mentioning the children as well. During a critical part of their development where their psyche's developing, their brains are developing, they're learning about justice and love in the world, being able to help them as early as possible or extricate them from
Yeah,
damaging situations, and then allowing them to have one of their family members who they love the closest and who presumably hear all the secrets. Pets will hear the secrets and the love and
yeah.
and everything. That's so important.
As a child, you don't grow up with any biases. You don't start off with any biases or prejudices. And it's the same with animals. You grow up with an animal. I don't think you think that they're an animal. They're your friend, your brother, your sister. And they just make a funny noise and they walk around on four legs instead of two, most of them are, but they're just the same as you are. So we then start to install those prejudices and biases from a very early age. When they're young children, they're critically important to rip them apart when they're already being ripped apart, seeing the two adults in their life fighting, for example. It's horrendous.
I read that recently there were changes to rented housing agreements in England and Wales to now include the right to take a pet to a new rental home. How do you think this will impact victims seeking to flee abuse?
It's not in yet. This piece of legislation is not in yet. In New Zealand, it's further ahead than England and Wales is. I'm hoping that it'll be in the next term of Parliament. I think it'll make a massive difference. It really changes the emphasis on the landlord. At the moment, the landlord can say no pets. It changes that burden of proof over, so that it gives more rights to the renter now, or it will do. So there will be more homes available for them. Yes, they might have to pay a higher insurance policy, but at least there's a home that they can hold. They can take the animal and the children and themselves too, and getting out at a critical time where if they don't get out, potentially again it's a domestic homicide. So it sounds dramatic, but it will save lives. If you can get animals out with the family, then you will reduce the numbers of murders of domestic homicide. I'm quite clear of it. I don't know how we'll ever prove it, but logic suggests that's naturally going to happen.
I absolutely, completely agree with that. You shared a photo on social media of you as a young boy and your dog Joe.
Yeah, he was, he was part of my family from the age of 5. He certainly definitely knew all my secrets. I definitely confided in him. He chewed all my toys. Like I had like farm animals set. Obviously I had loads of animal toys, most of which only had 3 legs or no head, but it didn't, that didn't really matter because he could get away with stuff. I mean, he used to spend every night in my bed, sleeping down the end of my bed. So we were like so close to each other. One yeah, I probably wasn't much more than about 6 or 7 at the time. He was great as a dog, but I thought he might look good as a tiger. And I got up early in the morning and helped myself to my mum's like flower tin, and I painted stripes all over him because he was like a rat. So when the family came down, we had a tiger in the house. It was like, but he was he was very tolerant of me, and I was pretty tolerant of him, I guess.
Oh my goodness, I love it. Joe sounds magnificent. How long was he with you then?
At 13, he was 13, I think, 13 years. Yeah, it was a great time. I mean, I guess I learned loads from him. We spent all the time together.
There are a lot of animal welfare groups out there who are frustrated by the lack of seriousness with which animal cruelty is often treated. What strategies or ideas can you recommend to help them be heard and drive change?
I don't have all the answers. Lots of different systems work. My own thoughts are that at least consider some different tactics. If you're trying to encourage someone to make the changes that you want them to make, my approach is that waving a placard in their face and shouting at them and complaining about them probably might not get you what you want. But if you sit down and try and understand things from their perspective and find a common ground where you can both move forward together, might give you a better solution to the one you've tried already. It's not always going to work, and there's absolutely a place for all kinds of campaigning and activism and everything else, but at least try that dialogue, try talking to people and trying to find that middle ground. After all, the animals deserve that.
If anything, that's the best motivation you could have shared. Use the approach that is going to benefit the animals the most. So you've got to work with people and not necessarily villainize them or shame them. You've got to say, okay, this is where we're at, and try to help guide them there.
Yeah, I mean, I said sort of at the beginning of the conversation, really, that when you actually sit down, you find you want the same things anyway. You just were coming at it from a different angle, and once you find that mutual ground that will enable you to both achieve your objectives, there might need to be a bit of conciliatory dialogue to not get exactly what you want. But most things are resolved through negotiation anyway, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a war. You're never always going to get what you want, but let's try and make some progress towards your objectives.
So I know this is not going to be an easy question at all, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can create a more compassionate society, one where animals are also included in the circle of care.
If I can reach on sort of some examples, I guess. Again, I'm going to go back to Ukraine because obviously they've had it pretty hard, Ukrainians, for a couple of years. Had it hard for a long time. But one of the things that we started doing when we worked there was to encourage responsible ownership. And now there's a lot of work goes on in the villages where police officers are meeting children and talking about what it means to be a responsible animal owner. So that's happening. But also I've got a colleague out there at the moment who's introducing a system into the schools which is embedding compassionate animal behaviour within the general syllabus. So it's not about animals, but it's about including it within every part of their curriculum, their society, so that from a very young age they understand compassion and how things fit together. I mean, again, as a child, I was fascinated by how Native Americans lived alongside animals. Didn't always agree with all of it, but I was fascinated by how that they lived with the land as opposed to trying to fight it the whole time. And I used to read books of that really used to fascinate me. What the work in Ukraine is going on is hopefully creating a more compassionate society. And I know that when the war started over 2 years ago now, the images that were being beamed around the world of people fleeing but with their animals wasn't always happening, but with their animals were huge. And on social media, they were the ones that were getting all the attention. Why were they getting attention? I think because people like to see that. They actually want to see compassion. I think a lot of people are fed up with sort of the hate and arguments and seeing things in a polarized way and trying to find a compassionate kind of way forward.
What gives you hope and keeps you motivated after all these years in law enforcement and animal protection?
young people. I think I'm really lucky in that I mentioned a little bit earlier about talking to universities. When I speak to the fact that when I'm talking to people who are representing animals now, they're all young lawyers. They're really, really bright, switched on people that are fighting for animals for justice, not in an aggressive way, but in a professional way, and really representing the animals to the best of their ability. And I see that in so many countries, and I see it in so many countries that people have thought that they're not doing very well from an animal welfare perspective. I'm doing some training in Kosovo. Month after next, next month I'm in Estonia, and these are all countries who are really pushing forward on animal welfare, not just animal rights, but animal welfare and improving standards. Long way to go, but I see it in so many young countries, young people, that I'm definitely far more positive than I have been for a long time that things are changing.
I'm so glad to hear that. I am super, super glad to hear that. People listening to this episode are people who obviously care deeply about animals. So I also want to mention a free resource they can get, a workbook called Secure Your Companion Animal's Future, that will guide them through the 3 things they need to do to make sure their companion animals are taken care of for the rest of their lives, even if something happens to their owners. The workbook is available at readywhenstuffhappens.com/learn. And before we go, I want to let people know how they can get in touch with you and follow your very, very important work.
And initially, have a look at the Nature Watch website. That's probably the simplest. It's naturewatch.org, and it talks about all the different campaigns that we do. And it's a tiny organisation, but does loads and loads of work, from puppy farming to cosmetic testing on animals to wildlife crime, and also covers our work in Eastern Europe, but particularly the campaign that I'm involved in, which is the Protect Animals, Protect People campaign. It's about breaking the link between animal abuse and domestic abuse at the moment, and showing that the safest societies really are those where animals for people are those where animals are protected.
Thank you so, so much for having taken the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.